I think that's one of the positive things about broadcasting and inside the BBC is that it's still an organisation in which programmes, for most of its history, have been made by real people, flesh and blood people. Hello. The festival director, Nick Barley, has asked authors if they would, as an act of solidarity with Salman Rushdie, offer a short sentence or two from something that he's written. So before Sam and I begin, I wanted to just read a couple of sentences from Salman Rushdie's Haroun and the Sea of Stories, which means something to me because I read it to my children when they were younger. It's very short. Nothing comes from nothing, thieflet. No story comes from nowhere. New stories are born from old. It is the new combinations that make them new. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this event. My name is Sam Knight. I'm a staff writer at The New Yorker magazine, and it's a great pleasure to be in conversation with David Hendy. David is the Emeritus Professor at the School of Media, Arts and Humanities at the University of Sussex, and we are here to talk about his wonderful, overflowing and all too human history of the BBC. The way the event is going to work is that we'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then there will be time for questions at the end. I'm told it's got to finish sharply on time. We have an online audience joining us as well today, and their questions should come through to me too. I understand that the online audience, it's a pay what you can afford system, and I know that the festival will be extremely grateful for any contributions that you're able to make. It enables them to put on another brilliant program next year. And David will be signing books afterwards in the signing tent. This is my housekeeping. It's done. David, welcome. You are a distinguished historian of broadcasting, particularly radio. I'm really interested in your own formative experience of the BBC. And you joined as a trainee in 1987. I'm really interested in your own kind of personal journey as someone who used the service and then joined it, ultimately it becoming the object of study. Tell us about that.
Well, okay, so yes, I joined the BBC as a trainee reporter in 1987. I kind of, as young people wanted to get into television. And actually I ended up getting into radio and getting into journalism, which wasn't, again, necessarily what I was interested in. I was interested in art and culture and so on. But anyway, it was a trainee scheme in journalism that opened the door to me. And so I worked as a reporter and a producer, eventually working in news and current affairs on Radio 4, The World Tonight, which was a wonderful program, and a series called Analysis, which is a kind of fairly highbrow sort of public policy kind of series. I suppose what that has led me towards, I suppose, is an understanding of the BBC, and sometimes you need to be outside as well as inside the BBC, as a kind of fallible human organisation.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why this is called a people's history. The subtitle is A People's History, because I think it's easy to have a view of the BBC, which is, here is a grand institution. It's dignified, it's established, it's kind of almost a kind of organ of the state in a way. And it's easy also, I think, to think of programmes as things that are kind of made to order, machine-made in some way, formulaic, and people following orders.
Sort of coming down from above.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And of course, there's an element of that, particularly perhaps in news and current affairs. But actually, you know, as a program maker, you understand, first of all, that it's much messier than that. It's much more organic than that. And also, you're aware of your own fallibilities and your own biases and prejudices and so on. And actually, I think that's one of the positive things about broadcasting and inside the BBC, is that it's still an organisation in which programmes, for most of its history, have been made by real people, flesh and blood people, who come to the task with a kind of set of ideals and fallibilities, as I say, and I think that gives you a sort of, creates a tension when you then leave the BBC and start to actually kind of study it more objectively. There is then that sort of subjective voice that is also there that I hope means that it's not just about understanding how programmes get made, but understanding, if you like, the kind of the messy, organic nature of the way in which the BBC develops and the way in which actually people, I think, in a really meaningful way, are part of that story.
No, and it comes through really strongly in your book, because the BBC is not only something that many of us kind of think we sort of intuitively understand, but it's also an organisation that tells stories about itself. You know, this is the 5-volume Asa Briggs history of the BBC. There's this official corporate history that it's writing of itself, whereas I think your book takes this more human and kind of under the skin approach.
I think, I mean, for me it had to, because I wasn't, I mean, to kind of reference the Salman Rushdie that I've just quoted, I'm not coming to something which is entirely new here. I mean, there have, as you say, been 5 volumes of Asa Briggs' official corporate history, a 6th volume from Gene Seaton, 4,000 pages, Asa Briggs, published, written over 30 or so years, another 400 or so pages from Gene Seaton. Now, I mean, the first thing is that it would be both relentless and actually a bit pointless to just say, well, the book I'm going to do is just going to condense that down, and I'll kind of write a sort of condensed institutional history. And the researching the BBC and writing the BBC has been described by Stefan Collini as it's a researcher's dream and a Borgesian nightmare. and the reason for that is, I mean, if you think about, here's an institution which has been around for 100 years. It has broadcast somewhere between 10 and 20 million programmes, right? I mean, we can't be sure, it's impossible to count. Tens of thousands of people have worked for it. The written archives are miles and miles of shelves.
It's always been fascinated by itself.
It's always, and it's great because the reason that the written archives are actually so fascinating is because here you have an institution which is stuffed full of creative people, but it's also got enough of a civil service mentality to minute everything. Yeah. So all of these kind of creative arguments about what programs are we going to make? Why did that one work? Why did that one not work? And so on. They're minuted. They're there. They're there in the written archives. And so you've got this sort of where do you begin? In the wartime, for instance, the BBC was split up into 250 locations. So and again, so you can't really. I mean, or at least I felt I couldn't come up with another institutional history. I couldn't really write a history of the programs because, well, if there are 10 to 20 million of them, it's only going to be a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1% that you can kind of include and reference. I can't really write a history of the departments and the units because there are so many of them. And so for me, the people and what they tell us, ultimately, it's about what do they tell us about the BBC-ness of the BBC, I suppose, was what I tried to hold on to. And the one thing that actually then came to my rescue, I think, was that I was given privileged access to this extraordinary treasure trove, which is the BBC's Oral History Archive. Now, the BBC, in 1972, the BBC was celebrating 50 years, and it realised that the first generation of people who worked for the BBC were about to disappear, and that it needed to capture their memories. So it started a programme of recording on audio and film, extended interviews with key members of staff, director generals, engineers, governors, but also programme makers, people who ran the duplicating section, lift attendants, and so on. There are about 600 of these, and they've essentially been kind of gathering dust in various bits of the BBC. And as part of the BBC's sort of thinking about the centenary, it gave me the opportunity to have a look at them. And they are extraordinary. I mean, they are eyewitness accounts of kind of key moments. You've got John Reith, giving a vivid account of the time that he was running the BBC during the general strike. You've got extraordinary witness accounts of the Second World War, the origins of television, the coronation, the Suez Crisis. David Attenborough, for instance, a vivid description in his oral history where he is the one who calls on Anthony Eden to prepare him for his famous television broadcast about the Suez Crisis, and finds Eden in bed in his pajamas with his wife putting mascara on his moustache. It's like, well, that's going to go in the book.
Yeah.
That's definitely going to go into, I don't know how or why, but that's going to get into the book.
There's so much I learned from your book, and it's impossible, I found, not to be drawn into the kind of amazing Protean kind of utopian spirit of those early days on Savoy Hill. There are these amazing descriptions in David's book of the kind of performing Hamlet in the corridors because the acoustics are better than in the studios, 4 tons of curtains on the wall to try and limit the sound, amazing notices saying, do not rustle the papers or you will deafen thousands. It's amazing kind of atmosphere of the place. But there's also a political intention there. I wonder if you could can you define the politics of John Reith and these particular years after the wreckage of the First World War?
I think to some extent, John Reith is an incredibly complicated character, and that's one of the things which is so magnetic about him. But yes, it seems to me that there is a sort of traditional way to start the history of broadcasting, which is with the story of radio and the story of wireless and the technology. Now, it seems to me that most of those accounts of the beginning tell us what happened and how it happened, but don't really tell us why it happened. And so I was really, really interested in trying to get into the heads of the kind of creative nucleus, the first generation of people who set up the BBC in 1922. And it seemed to me that if you go back to their accounts, their memoirs, their writings, their health records, everything, and look at those people, what comes across is a sense in which here is a generation of people who have just come out of the Great War, right? It's been an extraordinary formative experience for them. There is this sort of sense that civilization has sort of shown that it's just skin deep, and barbarism has been unleashed, and so on. And in the 1920s, you've got many people, particularly intellectuals, who are despairing at human civilization, and that it will ever kind of progress again. But what you've got with, say, the 3 people that I begin the story with, and John Reith is one of them, the other one is Cecil Lewis, and the third one is Arthur Burrows, is people who come out of the war with a distinctive set of experiences, and therefore ideas. And the BBC, I think, is ultimately an idea rather than a technology. So just to kind of run through those 3 very briefly, Cecil Lewis is just 24 years old in 1922 when he becomes the deputy director of programmes at the BBC. He'd been a teenage fighter pilot during the war, so he'd been, as a teenager, flying planes over the Western Front, and he was exhilarated, as a teenager might be, in charge of a fighter plane, exhilarated by their technology, the sense of mission, the sense of purpose, but he also looked down to the trenches below and despaired at the kind of the wastefulness, the conflict, and so on. And he comes out of the war with a kind of desire to kind of, how are we going to heal the world in some way? How are we going to increase mutual understanding? And for him, it was going to be something to do with art and music and poetry. Those were the kind of transcendent things that would somehow heal humanity. Then you've got John Reith. He's a bit older. He's 33, brought up in a deeply religious household in Glasgow, and with a sort of sense that he's got a calling from God to do some good in the world. His father is a minister of the church and tells him you have to serve God by serving the public. His mother does kind of Christian good works in the city, opening libraries and running reading groups and so on. And so he's got some sense that he's got to do something for the public, but he doesn't quite know what. And then you've got the third person, Arthur Burrows. He's 40, he's the oldest. from a more humble background, brought up in Oxford, where his father was a porter, his mother was a part-time teacher. And he's the one who knows about radio, and he knows about wireless, because as a journalist, he spent the First World War eavesdropping on enemy wireless propaganda. And he's very struck by this notion, the danger of disinformation spreading by wireless. And he talks about, well, if it's so easy to spread disinformation through the wireless, why do we not spread truth ions in the ether instead? Why do we not disseminate common sense and truth and so on? And so and these three people together are, in a sense, channeling the spirit of Matthew Arnold.
Yeah.
You know, that great Victorian writer in Culture and Anarchy talks about how do we hold society together in a kind of post-religious sort of age. It's through culture, or sweetness and light, as he called it. Matthew Arnold's idea was that it's not just about you cultivating your own sense of culture and understanding and appreciating the good things in life. Sweetness and light has to prevail. Everyone has to be part of this. And so what we get is kind of with these three people, the coming together of this idea, this spirit of Matthew Arnold, and realizing that in the 1920s, it's radio, this thing that spreads words and music freely through the ether, to use the words of Arthur Burroughs, from the humblest cottage to the richest palace, equally accessible to everyone. Yeah. And so the notion, and again, this is a kind of famous quote of John Reith, which echoes exactly Matthew Arnold, that the point was to allow the best that has been thought and said and done in the world to be available to as many people as possible. Yeah. Radio was the means to an end. That was a sort of political, cultural, and they might not have called it political, but that was the idea.
No, and I'm sure we'll circle back to this later, because it doesn't seem like there's an easy contemporary political label to put any, some of these collective ideas and elevating the population. You can see, some sort of left-wing ideas there, but Reith hated socialists. This is patrician. This is London. This is very much kind of delivered from on high. So it resists kind of easy categorization.
It does resist categorization, and just as Reith does, we think of Reith as a kind of conservative, and in many ways he was, certainly a small c conservative, and he could be pretty boneheaded about cultural stuff. But interestingly, before he kind of joins the BBC, he's casting around for a political career. And he first of all tries the Labour Party, and then he tries the Liberal Party, and he describes himself as essentially a liberal, and he ends up working for the Conservative Party briefly. And his line was, I'll work for any politician who kind of shows a kind of manly approach to Christianity. Yeah. That was his thinking. But that in the DNA of the BBC is, you're right, there's something in a sense conservative about it. How do we hold society together, right? Especially when we've got this sudden dramatic enlargement of the franchise, the electoral franchise. In 1918, it suddenly goes from about 8 million to 21 million. And there's a sort of sense of panic here. How do we make sure that all these newly enfranchised people vote sensibly? I mean, that's, But then there is also this social democratic idea as well of improvement and progress, because I think this is also absolutely part of the DNA of the BBC. It's this notion that culture and understanding is dynamic. It's not fixed. Yeah. That this idea that supply can shape demand, and that, again, another kind of famous Reithian notion of the BBC was that the BBC should be slightly ahead of public taste, right? But it shouldn't be so far ahead that people fail to follow. Yeah. And so that notion is, if we err on the upper side of kind of public taste, we will nudge it. We'll achieve a kind of cultural uplift. And it's this notion that people could change, people could find their better self. Yeah. And that broadcasting, again, was going to be the means to do this. And that's a kind of social democratic thing. In
many ways. Throughout the book, there are these, I found, really interesting continual tensions between, control at the center, innovation at the edges, or, between, improving and educating and, Strictly Come Dancing and Thought for the Day. You know, there's these perpetual kind of sort of tensions throughout the book. And one that I just wanted to talk about briefly was some of the regional ones. And I was really struck by, you know, the way that radio, and particularly radio documentary, you know, developed in Manchester in the 1930s. And I wondered, in the spirit of kind of talking about the people of the BBC, whether we could talk about Geoffrey Bridson. As I just found him such an interesting figure, and to think about his career starting with those documentaries in the 1930s. One was called Coal, and it carried live, hour-long interview with miners, and they had a sign in front of them saying, "Do not say bloody or bugger."
Yeah. Yeah, that was...
Right the way through to the civil rights struggle in America.
Yeah.
He's just... He's
Yeah, no,
such a
I mean,
fascinating
Geoffrey, he's one of my sort of heroes in a way. I mean, writing the history of the BBC is, you try to be a kind of rational, kind of objective historian, but there are people that you kind of fall in love with in the process. And Geoffrey Bridson is one of them. And he joins the BBC in the mid-1930s. He's a kind of young poet, raging in the streets of Manchester, as Ezra Pound said at the time. And he joins the BBC at the moment where the BBC, certainly in London, is becoming more cautious, kind of, and its upper echelons are being dominated really by kind of quite conservative figures. But and Reith basically banished anyone who was a troublemaker to Manchester, where, as he put it, you won't do any trouble. Well, ha. I mean, you know, Manchester became the kind of the great Northern Republic, and the person who was in charge of programs there was Archie Harding, who was a kind of Oxford-educated Marxist, and he counted himself as a Marxist. I mean, I think it was kind of, you know, politics came second to good radio as far as he was concerned. But he built around him a kind of team of troublemakers and experimenters. And what Geoffrey Bridson did was he just believed that the microphone should be made available to everyone. And there was a famous remark that Reith made in a memo that he sent out to every station director in, I think, 1924, which was, you know, only those men who have a good reason to speak should be allowed on the microphone. In other words, you know, the great and good, the established, you know, decent chaps. And here was Geoffrey Bridson and Archie Harding and other people like Olive Shapley working in Manchester saying, no, the microphone should be given to everyone. And Geoffrey Bridson set out to do a series of epic documentaries. The first one was actually called Steel, before he did Coal. And they were kind of these extraordinary with kind of music and poetry and voices, and to try and convey through sound the kind of, if you like, the magnificence, the dignity of labour. I mean, the one thing that I think got forgotten from those early Geoffrey Bridson programmes was the actual people themselves. They weren't actually interviewed. It was actually Olive Shapley who started to actually show that, actually, why don't we just actually interview miners and steelworkers and actually hear their voices on air, rather than have them as sort of an effect. And so by the time that Coal was broadcast, a couple of years after Steel, yes, Geoffrey Bridson, he goes underground. He spends a week or so living with miners. He works with Joan Littlewood, the theatre director, who's working in Manchester for the BBC at the time. And the miners are then brought into the Newcastle studio. So, I mean, recording is still in its infancy, really. So it's still, most programs are still live. The miners are brought into the studio, and he decides that as an experiment, basically, the kind of scriptedness, I mean, early radio was very, very scripted, because the BBC was just terrified. What would people say on the microphone? And if people said the wrong thing on a microphone, would that cause revolution? So they were terrified of live broadcasting.
The flip side of the power of the ether. Is
Yeah,
the kind of fear of what...
The fear, actually, the fear of the microphone was very, very real. But everything had to be live, so it had to be scripted. And here was Geoffrey Bridson saying, you know what? We're not going to script this one. We're going to have the miners in the studio, and we're going to ask them about their lives. And, of course, they spoke as kind of, you know, miners in 1938 would. And so it's actually Olive Shapley who runs into the studio with a sign saying, "Do not say bloody or bugger." And actually at that point, the whole conversation grinds to a halt, because they're suddenly very self-conscious about what they're going to say. And so she had to then come back into the studio with a sign saying, as you were. And so it flows again, and of course Geoffrey Brideston is reprimanded and he's in trouble because, you know, the boss class are listening in London, and this is a programme made in Manchester but broadcast throughout the country. And it's a kind of wonderful programme. And you mentioned as well, of course, that he goes through the BBC. He makes some wonderful programmes in the Second World War, and he goes to America where he meets Langston Hughes and works on an extraordinary programme called The Man Who Went to War, which is set in London during the Blitz. This is a programme that was broadcast in 1941, set in London during the Blitz, but actually with an all African-American cast recorded in Harlem. And so Geoffrey Brideston they're fellow poets, they love jazz, they have this friendship, and then in the early 1960s, we find Geoffrey Brideston working with Langston Hughes on a kind of epic 19-part series for what was then the third programme, which traces the African-American culture, the civil rights movement, and so on. It's
through music and poetry.
Through music and poetry and jazz and so on. So it's he's a really interesting kind of figure. And in a way, his importance is that even though he's not what you would call mainstream BBC, he's a reminder that there is room in the machine, as it were, for the grit.
Yeah. Winston Churchill is not a member, did not work for the BBC, but he's an amazing kind of recurring character in the book. And, we can all see the photograph of Churchill with the BBC microphone, and we think of his speeches during the Second World War. We think of him as an immensely gifted broadcaster, and yet highly ambivalent towards the BBC on a sort of on an epic scale.
Yeah.
And in the book, he really, to my reading, there's sort of these three acts. There's him at the general strike, trying to bring the BBC into government control in its infancy. Then in the war, where there's this kind of amazing, the BBC more or less does become a government department and becomes part of the British war effort. And then this final chapter in the 1950s, when under his government, the monopoly is eventually broken. And I'm really interested in your sense of whether that was a sort of, if you like, whether there was a sort of a rational, ideological distaste for the BBC on the part of Churchill, or was this just, it was a block on him at various points in his career? And I'm interested in whether you think that there's a sort of, if you like, a kind of a rational, long game attack on the BBC from Churchill's point of view, or whether it's more kind of, it just followed one thing from another.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I mean, I kind of think it's both. I think, and that's what gives it, kind of supercharges it, I think, with Churchill. So whereas Geoffrey Brideston, if you like, is one of my heroes, I'm afraid Churchill is one of my anti-heroes. Yeah. And it's because, it's important. If you look at Churchill from the point of view of the BBC, he is a bit of a pain, right? So in 1926, as you say, he threatens to take over the BBC during the general strike. He wants to turn the BBC into a state broadcaster to broadcast pro-government propaganda. And it's a real threat. Yep. It's a genuine threat. He then rages through the 1930s that the BBC isn't giving him a voice because he wants to talk about India, he wants to talk about empire and so on. And it's not necessarily the BBC that's stopping him. It's that actually at this point, it's the party machines that choose who speaks on behalf of the party about a subject. And the party machines regarded Churchill as a maverick. Yeah. And so that was part of the problem. But also he's sort of bearing a personal grudge with Reith about the general strikes still, I think.
Wow.
And he kind of complains about Reith. I mean, I think maybe it's because they're both these kind of strong, boneheaded characters. He calls Reith, who is tall, Wuthering Heights. Reith, of course, he looks like a villain out of a melodrama. So he's an easy target. And then in the war, there is this mythology, isn't there, that Churchill was an accomplished sort of orator. His radio broadcasts were not always well received by the public by any means, and there are occasions where, Churchill, for instance, in the aftermath of Dunkirk, Churchill comes on air And he kind of talks rather reluctantly and rather miserably about this is going to be a struggle that could take 1,000 years. It's not really what people wanted to hear. And then J.B. Priestley, comes on by way of contrast, and he basically says, look, he takes Dunkirk, which is a kind of extraordinary mess, and says, we snatched glory out of defeat. And he makes people feel as if they're already kind of winning the war, right? The ordinary people are part of the war effort, And Churchill struggles to kind of make that human connection in lots of his speeches. And at the same time, he rages about the BBC as kind of, stuffed full of communists and so on in the 1950s, as you say. Now, okay, so those all feel as if they're sort of personal slights. But on the other hand, I think he kind of touches on this notion, which political conservatives have had for several decades, which is there is something suspiciously collectivist about the BBC, if you like. And it goes back, now, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, across the political spectrum at the BBC, figures who are conservatives, we know that they're conservatives, those who are liberals, those who are perhaps sympathetic to Labour, with the government of Clement Attlee and New Jerusalem and so on, are saying, well, actually, there's a kind of similarity here between the ideas of New Jerusalem and introducing the reforms of Beveridge, slaying the 5 giants of ignorance and poverty and want and so on, building a better state, the welfare state, the NHS and so on. There's a kind of correlation between that and that kind of Matthew Arnold notion of spreading sweetness and light. That, we all chip in as license fee payers to a kind of collective resource, and even if...
improving hand of the state.
Improving hand of the state, exactly. And so I think that there's just something that kind of nags away at those on the political right about whether or not the BBC is sort of fundamentally sort of suspicious. And actually, for the first few decades, you've got kind of conservatives signing up for the BBC as a protector against Americanization and vulgarization, and something that could be relied on to be a guardian of decent spoken English and various things like that. But I think you've got a kind of creeping sense of doubt that predates, I think, Margaret Thatcher, becomes much more intense during the Thatcher era, and perhaps even more intense more recently. But I think we can see that.
Sort of the beginning of that kind of schism there. I find that there is this passage that David's referring to, this kind of contrast of the sort of the New Jerusalem building this new society after the Second World War, and a new Elizabethan age. Should this be a freer process coming from the people rather than sort of down from on high? I find that kind of very persuasive thinking.
Yes, and I think even after Churchill has sort of gone, and you've got in 1951, you've got a lot of new Tory MPs elected, and they sort of arrive at a time when people are kind of tiring of austerity and rationing and so on, and kind of people telling them what to do. And Churchill had kind of referred to this kind of dystopian idea of Qtopia. And the BBC somehow, its sort of do-goodingness people seemed a little bit tired of being told what to do, and there's a kind of, I won't repeat the line, but
I was just about to do
go.
No, you can do it because it involves swearing.
Yes, anyway, it involves King Lear and swearing, but
your book kind of inevitably makes a very strong kind of moral and intellectual case for the BBC, deriving from the values that we talked about of the founders. When you think about it seems continual political crisis that the BBC found itself in, really from, you alluded to Thatcher, but if we if we move the story through to, Iraq and New Labour falling out of love with the BBC at that point, what is your way to think about the moral or the intellectual case against the BBC? It's often framed in terms of, oh, it's waste, it's bloated, it's this, it's that, it's overpaid people, it's drivers, it's all, we're all familiar with that kind of, that concept of the BBC, which, as you make clear, is kind of inaccurate for a bunch of reasons. But what about a kind of a deeper kind of political objection to it?
Well, now you're putting me on the spot because you're requiring me to try and articulate the case against the BBC, and of course, I hope that the story I tell is critical where it needs to be critical. I would call myself a critical friend, and in the end, when the chips are down, I'll stand up and fight on behalf of the BBC, right? But now you're asking me to articulate a case. I suppose what I would say is that I think, yes, away from the kind of, if you like, the froth of waste and so on, which I think, there are lots of rational arguments against that, where you can kind of say, as an institution, the BBC is, and here's the data, more efficient than many institutions and companies of a similar size. I think it's this sort of notion, if you like, of consumer sovereignty. And Margaret Thatcher kind of articulated it perhaps most clearly, this notion, and it kind of does touch on that new Elizabethan kind of notion that you mentioned, which is essentially a kind of, if we are in an individualistic era, it doesn't make sense for us to be contributing a license fee payment, for instance, to something which we don't use, which other people use. Now, for me, I would argue against that. Actually, let's hold on to that notion that in life and in society there are certain benefits, not just to contributing to something that you might not need now, you might need later in life, but also, why should we not contribute something to the collective good? Contribute something that someone somewhere at some point, someone else might need, and in the meantime, you're contributing to a national resource which will hopefully improve public knowledge and public discourse and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that, beneath the froth of whatever Nadine Dorris says about the BBC, I'm sorry, beneath that, there is a kind of, essentially a struggle between a kind of individualistic kind of notion of society and one which wants there to be space for something collective and something shared, where, again, the parallel, I suppose, and it's an obvious one, is the NHS. You pay into it, we all pay into it, and hope we don't use it, right? But it exists, and like the BBC, it exists and makes perhaps Britain a better place for it.
Yeah, and one of the effects of reading your book and tracing some of these tensions throughout, I saw, in 1987, the year that you joined the BBC, the Daily Mail was calling it biased, bankrupt and corrupt. The Spectator was saying it was anti-British. It's tempting to look back and see the kind of ebbs and flows of political argument, and in a way that can make you feel like, we've had 100 years, we'll have another 100 years. These ebbs and flows will continue to kind of to course their way through the way that we kind of imagine British society, and we want it how we want it to be. And you asked this question in the book, is this just part of the ongoing conversation, or are we in a different chapter now? And do the stakes feel very different? And it seems to me that they are at the moment.
Yeah, I think we are in a different chapter. So, Charlotte Higgins said in one of the pieces that she wrote about the BBC has crisis in its bones. And we've talked about the general strike, and we've talked about the Second World War, and so on. Clearly, there is this ongoing tension between governments. And as you mentioned, it's not just the Conservatives, New Labour during the Iraq War. We all know about Andrew Gilligan, the Today programme broadcast, Alistair Campbell's reaction to it, and so on. I do think we are entering a particularly dangerous moment for the BBC. So the political journalist Peter Oborne, not a man of the left, essentially he would describe himself as on the right. Peter Oborne has written about what he calls a moral emergency in British political life. And he particularly points at, Donald Trump in America and Boris Johnson in the UK. And what he's alluding to is this notion that so much of kind of public discourse has sort of relied on what the constitutional historian Peter Hennessy called the good chap theory of government. That, in other words, if you were organising a kind of political debate in a broadcast, you would generally assume that the participants would be telling the truth. They might disagree, but they would be kind of making their arguments in good faith. But we know that Boris Johnson doesn't do this. But also, I think particularly since 2010, particularly since 2019, we have a government, I'm afraid, that is careless about institutions. And I mean careless in the kind of literal sense that they don't really care. Things can be broken if that helps them stay in power. And there's another sort of more sinister dimension to this, which is the attack on the judiciary, the attack on the civil service, the attack on universities, and the BBC is kind of part of that in a way. Yeah. Which is the kind of, I recently attended a kind of a history festival that was sort of dominated, I suppose, by conservative historians. I'm not quite sure why I was invited, but I was there. And the phrase that I kept on hearing people mutter was the liberal metropolitan establishment, right? And so there's this sort of culture war rhetoric that seems to imply, if you like, that it's the kind of liberal metropolitan values have power. They are the establishment, and that it is the insurgent kind of force. And Liz Truss, our next Prime Minister, we have to presume, will maintain and perhaps heighten this, that she presents herself as an insurgent, an outsider who will get rid of all these kind of blockages in the system that are stopping the elected government from kind of doing its business. And I think that it's a particularly ideological kind of government in that sense. And I think that they are careless, and it wouldn't matter to them if 100 years worth of a broadcasting institution that is famous around the world, that is generally respected as a kind of global brand, that does still have some kind of respect for kind of standards, for truthfulness, and so on, despite all its kind of hiccups and faults and so on. It wouldn't matter to them if that disappeared.
And it's a chilling thought. And for me, this idea that the BBC's budget has reduced by 30% in real terms since 2010. That is not an experience it has gone through as an organisation in its first 100 years. And there is a sense now within the organisation of rationing, of reducing, I think in the technical phrase, excuse me, audience-facing parts of its business to try and meet it is in actual retreat. And I kind of, we all, British adults consume on average 18 hours a week of BBC content, 2 hours, more than 2 hours a day. And yet it does seem to me as a consumer and as a citizen that it does not have the courage of those early convictions, if you see what I mean. It produces the content, I feel, but without that form, without that early confidence of improving society and seeking a collective spirit. Even though it delivers on those moments, we all watch the
Women's English. I think that's true. It's kind of I mean, I think inside the BBC, not a huge number of people kind of know its history, and I mean, I'm probably going to be, this is indiscreet, I understand, but I mean, I was, at one stage a few years ago, I was invited to give a presentation to some senior channel controllers and figures at the BBC, one of whom happened to be the person who is now the Director General.
That was very indiscreet.
Yeah. I mean, no one's listening. And I talked about John Reith, and I talked about Reithianism, and I offered some quotations. I didn't say they were John Reith. I put some quotations up on the screen and said, you know, who are they from? And most people around the table thought it was Barack Obama, but it was John Reith. Now, there's something. It included a quotation from John Reith about how entertainment was important, right? Because, you know, to quote another Reithian phrase, what is broadcasting for? It's to help nurture true citizenship and the leading of a full life. Now, what does the leading of a full life mean? It's not just about all that serious stuff, news and current affairs or opera or whatever. It's about entertainment as well. It's pleasure as well as virtue. And so, you know, those kind of, in a sense, what is the DNA of the BBC? Ultimately, what is it that is distinctive about the BBC? And enemies of the BBC say the BBC ought to be more distinctive. Now, what they mean by that is just do the really, really small stuff that no one watches or listens and let the commercial sector do the rest. But no, what is distinctive about the BBC is its social reach and its diversity of programmes. It might be imperfect about that, but its social reach is this idea that actually it is for everyone, equally. And the diversity is we will not achieve a full, rich life as citizens unless we have a mix, we all have equal access to the full range of programmes. And I think you're right, that in a sense it's sometimes not easy for people in the BBC to kind of articulate that as a kind of grand vision. And yet, I mean, and this is where I kind of hold out hope. I mean, you mentioned Strictly Come Dancing. Strictly Come Dancing, I think, is Reithian. It's Reithian in the way that, say, The X Factor isn't. Strictly Come Dancing is a kind of, it's a really creative, interesting reinvention of an old programme, Come Dancing, which started in 1950, with kind of reality TV format. So you have some of the kind of generic reality elements, you know, celebrity casting and public voting and pantomime villains as judges and so on. But you also, I think, in something like Strictly Come Dancing, have this idea of the journey. Yeah. I mean, it can be a program maker's cliche, but it's about a group of people who are trying to achieve their better self. And in a sense, that's a kind of reason. There isn't cruelty in Strictly Come Dancing, as I think there is in something like X Factor, right? There's a sort of kindness to it. And so I think there are in programs like that seem as if they're just standard entertainment programs, still, in some sense, kind of Reithian values. They're still there, but I think you're right that it almost sort of happens without a sense of appreciating the kind of original DNA and the original vision. And I think, well, maybe that's inevitable, right? I mean, those pioneering days are really hard to kind of keep going. And through history, you have these moments, you know, when television starts in the 1930s at Alexandra Palace, you have this kind of moment, the pioneering days again. Yeah. So, and when BBC Online starts in the 1990s, the people involved felt that they were pioneers. They were pioneers transforming the BBC from something that was about television and radio into something that was about television, radio, and the internet.
I'm going to stop hogging you and open it up for questions, because I've already been greedy. Right, hands going up everywhere. Yusuf, really at the front, you're going to come with a microphone, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the functions of the BBC that suffered from, to borrow your phrase, carelessness is the World Service. Can you say a bit about its recent evolution and where you see it's pointing?
I mean, well, so, yes, and we... I mean, the BBC is an international broadcaster, not just a national broadcaster. I mean, I think there's a quotation that I read recently from the French journalist Agnès Poirier, who writes about how the BBC World Service is Britain's soft power incarnate. And I think we can trace that right back to the Second World War. I mean, well, so the BBC's international broadcasting begins in 1932 with the Empire Service, but it really takes off in the Second World War, where the BBC's role, broadcasting, you know, in collaboration with the Allied nations, the 22 Allied nations, and the dominions and the colonies and so on, is really important. It's especially important in Europe. By the end of the war, the BBC has been broadcasting, you know, generally reliable news in 46 languages, and about 20 million people are listening in Europe, in occupied Europe, very often risking their lives by listening to the BBC. And Agnès Poirier referred to this kind of the strong muscle memory that exists, you know, to that kind of, so her grandparents listened to the BBC during the war, and therefore she listens to the BBC globally. And so, you know, there is that sort of inherited reputation, and 500 million people are listening. On the other hand, what you're alluding to, I think, is the fact that it's not always been valued as such, both within the BBC and certainly within the government. So, I mean, again, sorry to go on about Winston Churchill, but one of the first things he does at the end of the war is to say, right, we don't need the BBC's broadcasts to Europe anymore, let's cut it. And then throughout the 1950s, you've got politicians who are constantly trying to fiddle with the World Service in terms of cutting the funding. So the World Service, for most of its history, I mean, it was called the External Services and so on, but for most of its history, it's had a different constitutional status to the rest of the BBC, not funded by the licence fee, but funded directly from the Foreign Office. And the Foreign Office has had a say in the languages that it broadcasts in and the number of hours that it broadcasts in. And the BBC, in a sense, retains the editorial freedom to then kind of determine what goes into the programmes. Now, this has sort of changed recently, so the World Service has, if you like, been swept into the licence fee funding regime. And there's both a danger and an opportunity in that. So I think the danger is that the World Service and its ability to kind of have a different priority in news, a different kind of a more internationalist perspective, could easily be diminished by being kind of subject to other pressures inside the BBC. It could be kind of cut, it could be minimized, it is being merged in many ways to the domestic news effort. There is an opportunity here, and actually I was very struck at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the ability of the BBC to actually utilize its mix of kind of World Service correspondence and domestic news correspondents to actually, I think, give an extraordinarily successful and wide-ranging kind of coverage to the opening weeks of that conflict. And you're drawing on its foreign language services and the expertise that reside there, its monitoring service, its kind of technical infrastructure and so on. And I think it's an example of, you know, we're constantly being told the BBC should be smaller and leaner and more efficient. Actually, but it's the size of the BBC and its ability to pull together these different bits of the machine. When it works, that's fantastic. So I kind of, in a way, my sort of short answer to your question is I'd keep my options open. There's a danger in the way in which the World Service has, if you like, been submerged into the kind of same funding mechanism when that funding mechanism is on its way out. But there is also the possibility of that international perspective infusing the domestic news service with a kind of more international dimension.
What about you, sir, in the corner there? Thank you.
You only indirectly touched on the role of commercial television or independent television. I'm mindful of one of Lord Reith's famous quotations. I can't vouch for its accuracy. It was along the lines of somebody inflicted chewing gum on this country, somebody inflicted dog racing on this country, somebody inflicted pool coupons on this country, and now we're to be inflicted with independent television backed up by commercials. But don't you think that the quality of the BBC quality of the programmes on the BBC that we see today has been as a direct result of its ability to respond to the competition that ITV presented in the late 50s and the early 60s. Otherwise, we might have had a more stale, authoritarian, highbrow range of programs which were not wholly responsive to what the public were wanting.
Yeah, I mostly agree with you. I think the arrival of ITV in September 1955 was a kick up the bum for the BBC, and you can see the BBC responding. First of all, generally speaking, it hasn't been giving much money to its television service, and then the money taps are turned on. So television can take off, and it can kind of create a kind of greater sense of gloss. Its presentation gets sharper, and the programs that come in the wake of ITV, which is very, very quickly winning the ratings war, right? The programs that come in, you've got in children's broadcasting, you've got new series like Blue Peter in 1958. You've got programs like Crackerjack, which are kind of supercharged and become kind of faster paced. You've got Panorama, which is kind of refreshed and becomes much harder hitting. You've got newsreaders who suddenly appear on air rather than just disembodied voices. You've got the Tonight programme in 1957. You've got the end of the toddler's truce when there was no broadcasting so that the children could be put to bed. So there's undoubtedly the case that you get a kind of shock to the system, which I think the BBC needed. The only thing I would say is that, of course, as a historian, you also become conscious of the slow, steady, organic changes that you think are already taking place. So you're aware of the fact that actually, the BBC has already, got soap operas running, that actually there are areas of its programming which are incredibly adventurous and kind of dynamic. And one of the areas that I point to in the book is places like Woman's Hour, which starts in 1946, and we kind of think of it, Woman's Hour, as, and in fact the first newspaper commentators in 1946 talked about, oh God, it's another program that's just going to have kind of fashion and recipes and so on. But no, it's kind of actually it's bringing in debates about politics, and it realizes that broadcasting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the women who are listening can actually enjoy very frank discussions about kind of what are called euphemistically marital relations, for instance. So there's some really adventurous programming which is going on under the radar. And again, if you read the accounts in the oral histories that I've looked at by people like David Attenborough, who joins the BBC in 1952 as a producer, he wants to get on screen, but his boss says his teeth are too big. He's never going to be on TV. So he becomes a talks producer. And he describes, along with people like Hugh Weldon, this vibrant culture in the BBC at Alexandra Palace and Lime Grove in the 1950s, where he says we would gather in the canteen and we'd have these constant discussions about whether we should use music and whether or not we were interviewing people in the right way, and when we should cut from one thing to another, and when we should use dramatic reconstructions. And they described it as kind of competing against themselves. They felt that they were a hugely creative generation. They'd come through the war, they had creative freedom, and that they were experimenting constantly. So I kind of think you're absolutely right. These external shocks are needed, and I think that was an important external shock. The interesting thing was it kind of happened in television, and in many ways it was radio, I think, that was at that time, to quote Geoffrey Bridson again, in the doldrums.
David, we are now officially out of time, so I'm going to ask you one last question, and you have to restrict yourself to maybe a 3-word answer. This is a question from online. In light of recent research on the viewing habits of young people, will the BBC still be around to celebrate 150 years of broadcasting?
I think it will be a bit like the NHS. It will exist in name, but I think there's a very real danger it will have, by then, I'm afraid, become something like public broadcasting in America. But let me say, I think that depends on how you might vote in the next general election.
Very good. Let's say thank you very much.